So I have another parable for us. This one's rather comical in some ways. It's a quote from Anne Lamott. If your wife locks you out of the house, you don't have a problem with your door, which is a really wise saying. It comes from her book on writing, which is actually called Bird by Bird. And she uses it there as a parable. The parable is for writers. And she says that sometimes writers will complain about having writer's block or that they're stuck. And she says, maybe the truth is you're empty. You have nothing to say. And so she uses that to talk about a writer having something to say. I'm sort of tempted at this point to think, so what might the parable of the locked door say about our lives? And my hunch is it could say a lot of things. But for me, it says that if we're going to think about where to look for a life worth living, we have to make sure we're looking in the right place, that we're not searching in vain for the wrong place. So we've talked about the quote from Socrates, and we've been examining our lives now for these 5 weeks in a very intentional way. And of course, we've talked about these two questions. What do you think makes for a life worth living? And how do you decide on an answer? But tonight we add a third question. What will we do with what we've encountered? What is the way forward? And I think this is incredibly crucial piece. I mean, it's one thing to say, I'm going to dedicate 5 weeks to readings, reflections, group time, etc. And then to just leave it there would just seem like a shame. It's not that it would be wasted time, but it wouldn't be making the best of our time. So we want to think tonight about what is the way forward and what does that look like? I called it sufficient proof. So let's get started. And I think you'll see where that comes from. It's the David Steindl Rast quote, that you've not yet died is not sufficient proof that you're alive. So if that's the case, and of course he's really getting at what does it mean to be fully alive, what would be sufficient proof? What does fully alive look like? And what would be the proof that we are living that kind of life? So we'll wrestle again with what does it mean to live a life worth living? How do I decide my answer? What will we do with what we've encountered? That's really the focus. And what does it look like in our day-to-day lives? I like this phrase, whether one believes in life after death or not, what should life before death look like? Another interesting question, if some devout Muslims pray 5 times a day, what do you do many times a day that shapes you? And are there certain habits, practices that can promote a life worth living? So we had, another reading from May that we read his other book, A Decent Life, but this one's from his book, A Significant Life. You read the piece where he says, unlike other animals, we recognize our lives as existing in a narrative fashion. There's a past, there's a future shaping our present. And sometimes, he doesn't use this phrase, but sometimes people will use the Latin Homo sapiens sapiens, not just Homo sapiens, those who are aware of self, but are aware that they're aware of themselves. And I think that really fits with what we're trying to do here when we think about our own lives. So he notes that whatever influence that past may have on us, it need not define our future. We can change. People do it all the time. He writes that stretch, that sweep, as he calls it, from who we were to who we are to who we'll be, that is our life. Well, okay, that makes sense. But in what ways has your past shaped your life at present? Well, clearly everything did, but are there certain childhood experiences or school experiences, occupation, choices made, whatever it is, that have brought you to the place where you are that you might want to reflect on? And when you imagine a different way of being in the world, which is sometimes the language used for making change, what comes to mind? What obstacles would there be? What might be there to help? He also observes that to ask whether life is meaningful is not to ask whether it's meaningful at this or that moment, although that's fine too, but it's to ask whether the whole is meaningful, at least up to that point. And then, of course, he notes that an objective definition of a meaningful life would be really hard to articulate. In fact, I think that's pretty much what the book says over and over again. But noting how our lives unfold over time is a good place to start. So, how does inquiring about the meaningfulness of your life overall feel different from measuring it at different periods of your life? And what difference do you think it makes to be asking these questions at this point in your life as opposed to earlier stages? We noted how this thing started at Yale and spread to other schools, but not many of us are in college. And you could even think, what difference would it make if I asked this question 10 years from now? And then, citing Aristotle, he describes a meaningful life as one sustained over time, even if we have those ups and downs. And he refers to that narrative approach that wouldn't just apply to how we come to know others, but even ourselves. He talks about getting to know that colleague that he had hired in the department. What would it be like to get to know yourself that way? And so he says these self-narratives, and this is really important point for him, they don't just reflect who we are. That's probably what we would tend to think, that if I describe myself, I'm telling you a reflection, but he says they can shape us. So if life is lived in bits and pieces, yet best measured in terms of the whole, how would you describe the meaning of your life in the big picture, the whole? And then a really interesting, what is your story? What is the story you tell others about your life? What is the story you tell yourself about your life? And how do these versions shape you? We didn't read this part, but in earlier portions, I thought this was really interesting. He adds a new twist to the age-old question, what is the meaning of life? He asks, what are the meanings of life, plural? I've read all kinds of stuff on the meaning of life, and I've never heard anybody use the plural. I thought that was just fascinating twist. So kind of playing with both of those, if you were confined to the singular, what would you say? And if playing with the plural, how might that feel different? How might that shape your answers differently? It's kind of freeing to think of there being, a plurality of possibilities, even for just one life. There's a great quote that comes from the photographer Sally Mann. She has a memoir, and she writes this line, "Do you know how a boatman faces one direction while rowing in another?" It's a pretty interesting observation. So in this final session, we're kind of invited to do two things. We're invited to look back on the previous 4 weeks and what we've learned, but we're also invited to kind of look over our shoulder to where we are headed, the way forward. So I think of, lots of possibilities, but one would be to just take time over the next few weeks to look back over the material we've covered. You could reread pieces that we've read, or wrestle the two big questions more intentionally, or take any one of the categories where we focused and kind of look back through the material. You could look back at the most meaningful quotes, like what's the one quote out of all the quotes, hundreds of quotes, that would be most meaningful to you, or to look back at your inventory and to think about how would you maybe change it all these weeks later. As for the way forward, well, it's an invitation to look even way ahead, specifically at our deaths. So you have to recall the distinction David Brooks makes between resume and eulogy virtues. We didn't read The Road to Character, but we talked about this briefly. The resume is when you're doing things to pad the CV, the resume, but the eulogy is what would be said about you after you're gone. So that's a fascinating question. What would we want our legacy to be when we are gone? How will we get there in this life? Similar piece, I remember this interview on National Public Radio, Robert Siegel, who used to host All Things Considered. He had actually 3 days in a row, an imam, I believe it was a Catholic priest, and then Joseph Telushkin, who was a very respected rabbi. And he asked each of them, what does your faith tradition believe about life after death? And so he asked Telushkin, what do Jews believe about life after death? It's my favorite answer of all time. Those who know aren't talking. Those who are talking don't know. Of course, then he proceeded to keep on talking. But it raises this question. Rather than focus on life after death, we're going to give our attention to life before death. What does that look like? What do we want that to be like? And it reminds me, and this is a strange connection, I realize, but I call it the Barbara Bird test. You can see my beautiful bald head there back in the background, seated next to Tex Sample and Jean Lowry and Nancy Howell there in the front. So every year at the seminary where I taught, the president's at the podium, there were commencement awards, and students were given a variety of awards. One of them was the Barbara Bird Award. And it was actually given to the student who showed a kind of tenacity of spirit. And that's because Barbara Bird found out she had terminal cancer, but continued with the program. She graduated with her master's and died the day after. So it's an interesting question to ask yourself. If you were dying, and you are, how would you want to live? Some people hearing about Barbara Bird said, I don't understand. Why didn't she pull out of school and, well, she did what she wanted to do. She wanted to give her life to this. So it's a question for all of us to wrestle with. All right, so now we're going to take a really kind of twisting turn. I'm pretty sure nobody who knows the name Adam Smith would expect him to show up in a course on A Life Worth Living. I certainly didn't, but a friend recommended this book and it was a great find. So Smith, if you don't know, is best known for his book, Wealth of Nations. He's a founding father of capitalism. And of course, capitalism is, as pretty much everybody would admit, it's a system built on self-interest. Proponents, those are supporters, they note that it rewards what comes natural to us. So if you care about yourself, you'll work hard and it'll reward you. But critics, of course, say, well, that's the problem. It puts self before others. So if you're known for that, how could there be something about great purpose? Well, Patrick Hanley's book is on Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is another treatise that Smith wrote. And it's a philosophy built not on self-interest, but on sympathy toward others. So what Hanley does is try to hold these two works in tension, although he mostly focuses on the theory of moral sentiments. So for instance, he writes, Smith, to put it bluntly, knew that there's all the difference in the world between learning how to get ahead in life and learning how to live well. So here's what he does. Smith believed that we're divided in many ways as persons. We're divided by our nature. He fully admitted that we have a lot of self-interest wired into us, but he says we also have sympathy for others. And, you know, if you think back to what we talked about in the Self and Others week, we pretty much agree with that. I mean, there is something in us that kind of wants to take care of self, but also wants to care for others. He says we're also divided by what the world we live in. There's a kind of need for tranquility, and yet there is this world's drive toward fame. So far, so good. So then he believed we needed one more division. And Hanley says it's his most important, unique contribution. The division between our objective and subjective self. Of course, we live in our subjective self. So what we needed was to develop this objective self that he called our impartial spectator. In other words, to see ourselves as others do. This is kind of an interesting question to wrestle with. If others were to describe what makes your life meaningful, what might they say? It's kind of the eulogy approach, but it's developing your own impartial spectator. And then another curveball. Thomas More in his book, The Re-Enchantment of Everyday Life, and this is one of our quotes that you may have circled. The soul has an absolute unforgiving need for regular excursions into enchantment. It requires them like the body needs food and the mind needs thought. So this enchanted worldview that he's talking about It's grounded in a world of facts. He's not like an escapist, but it's also the kind of thing that employs a holy imagination or a childlike fascination with things often overlooked. And as a psychotherapist, he makes this observation that when he was dealing with people that had failing marriages, careers, etc., that in many cases, in his opinion, they had fallen out of love with life itself. How would you describe your love for life at present? And it may be worthwhile to think back through what has the pandemic done to that. Here's the other side of the equation. Disenchanted Lives. Nobody has written more or more deeply on the forces working against enchantment than Charles Taylor. This book is an incredibly thick, hard read. If you want to set a high bar, here you go. He claims that we live what he calls cross-pressured lives. We long for, he totally agrees that we long for enchantment and magic, the kind that our ancestors had like a few hundred years ago, but fully aware of our scientific and postmodern world, thus the cross-pressured thing. So he says we believe while doubting. That's how another Taylor scholar puts it. So how would you describe your frame of mind? Is your worldview enchanted and believing? Or is it more of one disenchanted and doubting? Or does cross-pressured feel more accurate? And maybe you could say more about that in your groups. And then I've referenced this a few times, but the piece is just an amazing thing. This commencement address David Foster Wallace gave. This is Water. One of the things he does near the end of the address is describe an average adult day. Now remember, he's talking to college students. A long day at work, stopping for groceries on the way home because the cupboard's bare, heavy traffic, crowded store, janky wheels on the cart, long lines, lifeless checkout person, more traffic, and now having to fix dinner. We recognize that. That's life. This is what he says after that. The point is that petty, frustrating crap like this is exactly where the work of choosing is going to come in. Because the traffic jams and crowded aisles and long checkout lines give me time to think. And if I don't make a conscious decision about how to think and what to pay attention to, I'm going to be pissed and miserable every time I have to shop. The only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to try to see it. So how do you see the everyday world of your existence? What's your typical mindset, your kind of default mindset for life? I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but in Notre Dame's version of A Life Worth Living, which is actually called God and the Good Life, one of the leaders of that, she makes the observation that Muslims pray 5 times a day. And so to college students, she says, what do you do 5 times a day? Well, I tried to track down some reliable stats. It's incredibly hard to come by, but near as I could tell, some studies show that Americans check their phones about every 10 minutes, 96 times a day. And some studies as much as 160 times a day for about 2/3 of Americans. Most people hearing that will deny it. But how many times a day do you think you check your smartphone? And what other practices shape your everyday life? Jamie Smith is that Taylor scholar that I was mentioning a moment ago. And in his book, You Are What You Love, he pretty much doesn't just wonder, he pretty much posits the notion that Descartes was wrong, the I think, therefore I am quote. It's not that we don't think, but Smith says we're not thinking beings at the ground of who we are are loving beings. And we're defined by those desires, and we will think about those things. So we're thinkers, but we think about what we desire, and that's what kind of drives us. So for instance, shopping for new clothes, it may not make any rational sense. I don't even need a new sweater, not really. But if we've been seduced by consumerism, it doesn't have to make sense. We just have this longing inside us. I don't know, fueled by advertising, whatever it is. It appeals to our hearts and desires. And of course, then we start thinking about it. So what do you make of the idea that we're not always rational in our behaviors and practices? And if we were to ponder what our hearts are drawn to, how might that change our habits? And then it's actually a tiny book, this 12 Tiny Things, but the authors name some practices. I'm going to name a few of those that I've come up with under these headings. So if any of these are really kind of hot buttons for you, you might want to check out this little book. Space, work, spirituality, food, style, nature. You can see the list there. Whatever practices you pursue, though, most experts that are talking about practices and making changes, they suggest doing so for a minimum of 6 weeks to form new habits and new ways. So I put together a little list of practicing and practices. Take a walk. I know that some of you wrote emails to me saying how taking a walk during this has been a meaningful time of meditation. Care for a tree. I'm tempted to say at this point, if you don't get that one, I can't help you. I can't explain it. Just do it and you'll see. Feed the hungry. Read a good poem. Do deep breathing exercises. Forgive someone who hurt you. Talk to a therapist or spiritual advisor. Build a support network and a challenge network. I ran across this not too long ago. Friends sent it on, and I thought that was an interesting line. We think about having a support network, but what about a challenge network? People who would hold us accountable. Stroll through a museum and let one piece capture you. Kind of go into a museum thinking, I wonder if there's one piece in there that wants to see me or that wants me to see it. And then just focus on that one instead of wandering all over the place and hurrying about. And then last, see if you can find a penny on the ground and enjoy the find. The Pulitzer Prize winner Annie Dillard actually talks about how when we were kids, that thrilled our soul. And now maybe we don't even bend down to pick it up. And then one last thing. Jonathan Sacks, rabbi who passed away just this last fall, has a book, A Letter in the Scroll. And he pictures this huge library filled with books, just huge volumes. And they describe various values and lifestyles we might choose to live by. So you can kind of shop on the shelves to try and find what you're going to be drawn to. And he says you can pull any book. And if you like it, you can read more. If you don't like it, put it back. But after browsing for a long time, he says, you come across one with your family name on the cover. It is the story each generation of your ancestors has told for the sake of the next. Well, of course, you're drawn to this. But when you reach the last page, there's no entry. It bears only a heading, your name. And then the question, what is the story your life will tell? Kind of a nice little thought there. So I do want to kind of wrap things up as we move to group time by telling you just how grateful I am to Phil and Patty Love. They're down in Florida at the moment, and this would not be happening without their vision and support. And I'm grateful. It just wouldn't have happened. But it also wouldn't happen without you. I mean, I couldn't just sit here and talk to myself. I guess I could, but and so I'm really grateful for your participation. And I hope that you'll recommend this course to others. I'm actually going to email you tomorrow, and I'll send you a link to the registration, and I'll also send you the overview of the course. And I hope that you'll consider passing it on to 5 people that you can think of that might be interested, and then they can register for the course. 2 things that I want to say about the group time tonight. besides the 3 questions. And the first one is that there were a couple of group leaders who were emailing me today and had some things come up, and they tried to get a hold of groups, and some groups they got a hold of, but they weren't feeling well or they had something come up. And they assured me that you've got great cohesion by now and that you'd be in good hands just discussing with yourself. So I hope that's true. And I hope if you're in that group, it won't throw you too much for a loop when that leader is not there. And then of course you have the 3 questions: Instagram or Twitter, toast or eggs, passenger or driver. You can wrestle with the quotes for the week. You can wrestle with those questions that are there as well. And then one last quote by the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. Look, I am living. On what? It's something to think about. Hope you have a great time in your groups.